Okay, so our field trip's postponed because of a death in the family, as it were, right? There's just no way we get anywhere near the National Gallery with the streets that are cordoned off to give a buffer zone around the Capitol, right? One of them is a street that flanks the National Gallery, so that means as soon as we got anywhere near the National Gallery, we're going to get diverted somewhere or just come to a full stop. So it's just not a good idea to take that chance. And by Friday, he'll be in Houston. Actually, by Friday, he'll be in the ground in Houston. So it won't affect us then. So let's plan on leaving at 3 o'clock. That's nice because then we can sort of go through the heady stuff here and just spend time looking when we're down there, which is nice, rather than sort of taking notes and whatnot, right? We can actually stick our nose into these things and look at them more closely, which is really part of the point with abstract expressionism is to immerse yourself in them. And it will give us a chance to look at a few other things while we're there. The room that the Jackson Pollock is in also has Gorky in it, Arshile Gorky's picture in it, and it has your monster picture, your Joan Mitchell in it. So this actually works out okay. So we were looking at abstract expressionism and talking about one of two trends within abstract expressionism, action painting, which very much focuses on the artist's gesture, right? And that in many ways the subject matter of the painting is the gesture of the artist, right? As much as the woman or any kind of relationship to steel girders in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, right? Or anything like that. That's not really the subject matter. The subject matter is this record of a particular action at a particular moment. That's really what action painting is kind of all about in a way. And we were talking in class. Oh, that's right, that doesn't work. We were talking in class about how this relates to psychoanalysis, a different trend in psychoanalysis than we talked about before. We talked about with the surrealists. We talked a lot about Sigmund Freud and the idea of getting to your subconscious, right? Through dream imagery and through evoking childhood memories, right? Well, another prominent trend in modern psychoanalysis in the 20th century was a trend espoused by Carl Jung, Jungian analysis, which talked about trying to tap into something more universal, something less individual, what he called the collective unconscious, this wealth, this reserve of shared memories that we all have. It sort of sounds like theosophy, that there's something back there that we all have inherited from sort of our primal ancestors, this unconscious that we don't realize. And what Jung said was that one of the ways to reach the collective unconscious, one of the ways to uncover it, is through self-actualization, where you become aware of your actions. Because, in fact, the collective unconscious is often the motivator for these activities, our actions. And so when we think about action painting, where we see these traces, these remnants of particular gestures, these remnants of particular activities, these remnants of actions, we can think about it as being related very much to Jungian self-actualization, a way to become aware of your actions. And a lot of people think that Pollock is very much indebted to this because his paintings are, in fact, traces of actions at a particular moment, that he's immersing himself in that picture, and the paint that he dribbles on the canvas that's been tacked to the floor of his barn, right, end up being memories, traces of where he's been, right, traces of his movements as he works his way through. And the titles of the pieces sort of tie into that, because the titles remain elusive. They're number 1, 1950. That's the true title. And then the other titles sort of come up because of associations that they might have made for him, right? Lavender Mist is just an association that came out of the finished work. It wasn't what he planned when he started, right? It came out of the open start. But the title that really means something for Pollock is number 1, 1950, which might not seem like it means anything. But again, if we keep in mind that these are traces of a particular moment in his life, right? They are remnants of a gesture at a particular time. Then these titles start to make a little bit more sense. Number 1, 1950. Number 25, 1950. Seen as a series, they become his life. They become his biography, right? They become those actions at that moment. And we know that Pollock was seeing a therapist, and we know that his therapist was a Jungian psychotherapist. So we know that these ideas are actually pretty relevant to Jackson Pollock, right? They really do make all sorts of sense to him, right? They refer to his progress. They refer to him becoming aware of his gestures, right? Now, you've all heard of Pollock, but I mean, he's one of these artists that I guess transcends sort of art history. People hear about him. We know how he works, right? He takes a canvas that's not been stretched. It's not been put on stretcher bars, right? It's simply tacked down, nailed down to the floor of his barn, right? In the same way that Franz Klein would nail them to the wall and project those images on them that he had drawn small and now have gotten big, right? So he's not working on a stretched canvas. He's thinking about the canvas in a sort of different way than artists had traditionally done, where you put it on an easel and you work on it, right? He's thinking about the canvas as something, I don't know, bigger and broader than that. And then he'll stand over it, and as we saw in the photo, will take paint and drizzle it onto it, right? Never actually touching the canvas. And again, we talked about sort of the legacy of Dada, how important Dada is for sort of all art that came after it. We were watching a David Bowie video the night before last at home, Ashes to Ashes, and he's got this, it's sort of, if you haven't seen it, go see it, it's great. It's a great video. But my wife said, God, don't you just love Dada? Because it is sort of has that feeling, it's kind of like everywhere. And when we think about Hans Arp sort of dropping papers down and gluing them down wherever they hit, right? Then that's a crucial step to get to Jackson Pollock, who's sticking sometimes a brush, but sometimes just a stick into a can of paint and drizzling it. He's using not artist pigments, right? He's using industrial paints. He's using house paint, right? And a house painter's brush like Franz Klein was, but he was actually touching the canvas with it, right? So it sort of is interesting in that they're trying to be very non-traditional in their approach to the medium. And they're saying, okay, I don't need to use, Grumbacher, Winsor Newton paints, right? I can just do it with industrial paints. And this is why many of the Pollocks have colors that seem sort of, mundane in a way, right? Is because what he's drizzling, it's very difficult to drizzle paint from a tube, although we saw Kirchner do it, right? We saw Kirchner squeezing paint out of the tube right onto the canvas. It's another important sort of step in this direction. And that painting by Kirchner was in New York, right, by the time Pollock starts to do this. So these references are there, but he's using industrial paint, house paint sometimes it's even aluminum paint, right, truly industrial paint. And in fact, this one on the left, Lavender Mist, has sort of metallic aluminum paint, in addition to black and white against a sort of pinkish ground. Some greens in there as well, right? Really on a certain level, Pollock's work documents his progress. It's extraordinarily deliberate, and when we get down there, this will become more clear. But one of the things is before I taught this, I thought, okay, it's just doing stuff. But then the more you look at it, the more you realize that it's not just free. And what I mean by that is that it's not just sort of throwing things wherever they may be. But what he's doing is he's finding things start to happen in there, and he'll accent it by adding more to that particular area. And so when we look at the overall composition, you start to get these areas where it's coming down like this. And you can see he's sort of picked up on that, starts to add to motifs that begin to appear, not figural motifs, but just sort of compositional areas that begin to appear. And one of the things that I've been struck with, since I spent some time sticking my nose in this, right, is the degree to which oftentimes Pollock will double up the drips right on top of each other. It's very, really precise. Like through the years of working with this, got to the point where you can actually lay down a paint and come down with another paint, go right over the top and hit the same spot and try to line them up. So this idea of it being utterly random is something of a myth, right? I think that there really is a precision to the way in which he's dripping the paint. That it's not always just where it may be. And so when you get these areas like here, where it's extraordinary lattice work of lines, right? That's just not happening. That's really from practice.
These are like pretty big, right? So if it's painted on the floor, how does it get in the middle?
It's a handprint.
Does it like walk on it?
I think so, yeah. That's a good question. You just move yourself him at work, and I have to go back and look at them and see what he does. Does he walk back on? Because certainly they aren't quick,
Or does
right?
it like start with the middle and walk out?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? Or does he have a long enough stick that he can reach out to them, right? This picture, we'll get down there, right? When you walk up to it, and it's about this far off the ground, right? Your head's about here, right? So it's the better part of like 10 feet across or so, right? And that's a small one, right? Relatively, I mean, they range in styles. The one in MoMA is huge, right? 25 feet across. But they're usually not huge tall as well, right? And that's a long-standing question, And it's not just him. What do you think about Tintoretto? Okay, Tintoretto is this late 16th century Venetian painter, and there are paintings by him on canvas that are over 100 feet. And how the hell do you do that? How do you? And then when you're doing it, how do you handle the trampolining? Right? How does it when you hit it? It's not just like that. Believe me, I don't know. I have no idea. Right? But that's a very good question. How do you get to the middle of this, as it were? But again, I think a lot of it is wet and wet. If you look at that scumble of black and white that's at about right this bit here, you can see that it's wet paint going into wet paint. Right? But then there's other parts where it layers up significantly, like those blotches of red, which are very few, right? We're just right here. This is our detail areas right there, right? Very few and kind of important in a way, right? And if we think about all these details, then this sort of idea that he's just slapping paint down is really not what he's doing, right? They really are kind of extraordinarily methodical and precise in a strange sort of way, right? With this idea that he is recording his life, there's little accidents that happen. There's a raisin, right? Stuck in the paint, right? A dried right there, stuck in the paint. And it's just sort of, he was eating or something, or it fell out of his pocket, or, I've heard, and I don't know where to find it, we'll look for it, but there's a cigarette pack, crumbled up cigarette pack that's covered in paint on there as well, right? But he's recording sort of, these moments in his life, these periods in his life. And I think when these things happen, he could have gone in, if he saw it, he could have gone in and got that release right there. But he doesn't. He chooses to leave it there, which I think is kind of an important issue, right? Because he's, mistakes and all, it's part of that biography, right? That pictorial biography. And there are other things here, and I'll wait till we get down there to show you some of them that are in there. I thought about putting them in this part of it, right? And then again, that idea that he is in the painting. The painting is him. It's a biographical statement. Those handprints, right, that we see in both corners. It's obvious in the upper right corner, the big black one that you see in the detail here. But there are ones over here as well, right, around the edges, where he's laying, and that might be part of your issue, Eleanor. If you get your hand there, then you can get up here, right? You can add your body length into the painting, right? He first started doing this around 1943. Seems to be the earliest ones that we can put a date on for the drip painting technique that Pollock began. And this is one of the early ones. This is relatively small. It's only about 2 feet tall, right? This is how art history lies. They're both the same size on the picture frame, right? But this is just only about 2 feet tall over in the Hirshhorn, and rarely on display. The first drip paintings around 1943, and certainly, again, these have everything to do with Jungian analysis, which he was in the early 40s. But a huge debt to European artists in America. And we can mention a ton. I just want to mention two of them that we started off with on Friday talking about, right? One of them is Hans Hofmann, who we talked about, this expat who had come to America in 1932 began teaching at the Art Students League, had himself started doing drip paintings around 1938, 5 years in advance of Pollock. This isn't necessarily one of the drip paintings, but it's one of his early works that we have in a local collection. And Hoffman was teaching at the Art Students League in New York, and Pollock took classes there. Right? So there's a direct connection. This is not just, something in the ether out there, right? So that's sort of a huge thing. I guess I said two, I mentioned three, right? A second artist who is of huge importance for Pollock's drip paintings is André Masson, and this idea of automatic painting that we saw in the early years of Surrealism as a way for the Surrealists to discover the subconscious, now being used by Pollock to discover the collective unconscious. But remember that Masson had dribbled paint, had dribbled glue, and then dropped sand into the glue, and used that as a start to find something figurative within that, right? Miro did very much the same thing, but without the dripping, right? With just sort of wandering lines, either on the canvas or on a sheet of paper as a study for that, right? Masson had moved to America in 1940, right? So again, 3 years in advance of Pollock moving to drip painting. And what's interesting is that Masson's works after he moves to America get more figurative. And if we look at Pollock's work from around the same time, it's extraordinary, sort of similarity of these sort of amorphous shapes as Pollock is developing drip painting, because his works before then had become to cover the entire area and really open up into broad gestures, action painting. But he wasn't yet dripping, and even after he starts the drip paintings, he will continue to do works that don't drip, right? So this work from the Met in New York, Pasiphae, has forms within it that, as you look at it long enough, and it's quite large, really could very much remind us of what Masson was doing after he'd moved to America, right? So this is really quite a big influence on Pollock, I think, is the influx of these European artists. And the list could go on and on. I don't want to overplay that hand, right? But it's important to remember when we look at these side by side, is the degree to which, and I mentioned this on Friday as well, the degree to which abstract expressionism owes a huge debt to surrealism. That it's almost as if we could talk about abstract expressionism as being the sort of the way in which surrealism plays out in America, right? It begins with people like Arthur Dove and Georgia O'Keeffe, right? Especially with Arthur Dove, you can see how that then begins to trail into what abstract expressionism is all about. And as we look at the early works from almost all of the AbEx artists, what we find is that there's a strong surrealist undercurrent in what they're doing prior to moving into the established sort of mature style of what we expect from a Pollock, right? What we expect from a Mark Rothko, right? So for this picture on the right by Pollock, I wanted to mention one other thing that's important for abstract expressionism. Pasiphae was the mother of the Minotaur. We've talked about the Minotaur, the myth of the Minotaur. Picasso loves it, right? Picasso's surrealist works pick up on the Minotaur because he's half man, half beast. He morphs, you know what I mean? He's a surreal character in his own way, right? Had the half bull, half man. And Pasiphae is his mother, right, who had slept with him. So the story goes, right? And was often used, what Picasso used as a sort of a theme of madness, right? The myth of the Minotaur is a theme of madness about World War II, right? Well, for him it was the Spanish Civil War, right? So when we saw Picasso, whether it was the Guernica, I should have that up here now, or which was on tour at this time, right? Or whether it was in America, it was on tour in America at this time. That would be a good one to have up next to this, but I don't. Or with the Dream of Live Franco, or with the Minotauro Maki print. All of these things were sort of about the Minotaur as a symbol of the madness of war, right? And when we think about Pollock in 1943, why not? right? As America is getting close to we've already gone in, right? Pearl Harbor's 41. So is this also perhaps related to the ongoing battle in Europe of World War II? Now, with Pasiphae being the mother of the Minotaur, what Pollock did for this, it might look just like a wild series of forms, but look at the center part, right? And all of a sudden you can see that if you know your way around some earlier things, that he's based the overall composition on this great old Minoan fresco. This is in the palace that was believed to be the basis for the myth of the Minotaur. The palace at Knossos on the island of Crete, where we have this great fresco of some sort of ritual involving a bull and leaping over its back. And this is 1400 BC, right? 1500 BC. But is still tied directly to the myth of the Minotaur. And this is the basis of Pollock's Pasiphae, mining again the history of art for his images. Now, Pasiphae is, of course, important for Pollock for another reason, is that mythology. When Jung writes about the collective unconscious, he writes about numerous ways that we can actually tap into that shared humanity, right? One is through self-actualization, the understanding of our actions, right? And the things that we don't think motivate them that maybe do. Okay, that's one way. But the other way he says that the collective unconscious becomes apparent to anybody is through mythology. That mythology gave voice to these ideas that are primal that we all share. And when Jung talks about that mythology is a keyhole where we can look into the collective unconscious. He's not just talking about Greek mythologies, he's talking about mythologies writ large. In other words, mythologies could be religions as well, right? Stories of lost times. And he's really in the 40s, not entirely alone in this. Literary critics are writing about mythologies and how they present sort of narrative schemes that get repeated again and again and again. And I think that means the same thing for Jung and for the psychoanalysts, in that what we're trying to figure out is why things are the way they are, right? Whether for psychoanalysis, why we're so messed up, right? Why we can't handle emotional strains around us. Okay? And so how do you figure that out? One is to figure out the motivations for us. So Freud would say, look back at your childhood, right? But Jung would say, hey, there's nothing unique in what you're doing, right? It's based on the collective unconscious, and so let's figure out what are you doing, and then try to figure out if that's part of it, or let's look back at what people have done through these narrative arcs that we have from various mythologies over the years, and maybe we can then find that as well, right? We're all connected. It's kind of, and I find that to be much more hopeful than one tends to think when we talk about psychoanalysis as being sort of like, anxiety and whatnot. This is really tapping into what makes us all human, right? And so mythologies like this are our shared ancestry, right? And Pollock is tapping into that exact idea. As he moved on, he said that by moving from painting images related to these mythologies to actually dripping them, what Pollock said was that he was trying to veil any specific meaning. He didn't want them to be like, the Pasiphae is a particular mythology. But what he wants to say is that there's more to it than that. It's universal. So he ends up trying to work toward more universal themes. So on the one hand, instead of relating this to a particular water god from a particular mythology, he just calls it water figure, and that's it. And he makes it more generic as a title. And the idea is that when it becomes more generic as a title, it becomes more universally applicable, right? More universally resonant. And the step that then, of course, relates to that is the idea of to move away from painting to dripping. Because that also makes it more generalized, less controlled, right? At least at first. And not actually drawing figures down, but picking up the ideas of it. And that's, again, to veil the imagery, to make it less specific as he continues to work. So we'll have a chance to look at Lavender Mist Downtown. That's the only Pollock that's out right now. The last of the action painters that I want to look at, and I now know more about her than I have ever before because Eleanor's doing a paper on this and did the research I would have done myself if I had the time. So I made her do it instead. Joan Mitchell, equally gestural, right? Again, recording the movements of her hands and arms across the canvas. I really didn't know anything about Joan Mitchell before I moved to DC. We have so many good Joan Mitchells here. I've become like a huge fan. I just think she's really terrific. And her paintings, this is a bad comparison because a lot of Abex is really kind of grayscale, right? Franz Klein, right? Pollock, on the norm. It's kind of this, you know. But Mitchell is extraordinarily colorful, right? Extraordinarily colorful. And she's working with artist pigments, right? She's not working with house paint, industrial paint. And that's obvious when you look at them because of the range of colors that she has, right? But at the same time, she's not making any attempt to sort of bring the brushstrokes together and blend them into anything. They remain traces of actions through time. Now, she had schooled in Chicago, moved to New York at the height of abstract expressionism. She seems to have been very much influenced by people like de Kooning, who we looked at, insofar as the gestural quality, the sort of the vigor of her gesture. That would make a nice side-by-side comparison as well, because de Kooning's so violent, and I don't see violence in Mitchell's work. I don't get the sense she's tearing things apart, savaging them as she paints, where I do very much with de Kooning. After moving to New York, she begins to split her time between New York and Paris. I was putting this together the other night, and my wife Karen asked me, how did she do that? How did she afford it? Because, of course, Karen would love nothing more than to split her time between Washington and Paris. She must have been selling stuff. She must have had, or did she come from a wealthy background?
She had like wealthy friends who gave her their like house in Paris.
You still gotta eat. You know, there is that. But I think it was a lot. I think Paris was also significantly cheaper in the 50s than it is today. Right now, it's $500 a week to rent a place.
She didn't come from wealth, but she tried not to
Let that affect her.
she tried to like have her own thing. So.
Yeah, and I think that she had a couple shows already by the end of the 50s, and so I think she's got a moderate amount of success this way. And you know, when you don't have to go to a job from 9 to 5, then you really can live just about anywhere, right? If I could convert all my courses online, I could go back and live in Oregon. You know, if I get somebody else to get Joe to take over the department, right? Then I could just retire and teach online courses instead. When you don't have to actually punch the clock, right? Well, by 1959, she'd actually moved permanently to Paris, right? But this is during the period when she was sort of bopping back and forth between Paris and New York. And Rue Daguerre is a sort of a bustling market street in New York. In fact, there's a wonderful movie I saw a few years back by this great French documentary filmmaker named Agnès Varda. And it was on Rue Daguerre. Rue Daguerre is named after Louis Daguerre, who invented photography, right? One of the early inventors of photography in the 1820s. And it's a pedestrian street, and it's sort of off the beaten path. It's not really close to the place that everybody goes, right? It's in the 14th, if you know your way around Paris. 14th is a very working. Paris has what were called arrondissements. They're, what would you call them here? Counties, right? Or something similar to that. Like, you know how like Arlington there's Ballston, and there's Courthouse, and there's Clarendon, right? Okay, well, Paris has, and they're numbered, and the first arrondissement is right around Notre Dame in the center of Paris, and they sort of get bigger as they get around, right? And as you get to the 20th, you're all the way outside. So the last 6 or 7 arrondissements are sort of the outer periphery of Paris, right? And each one has its own mayor, right? I mean, they really are kind of independent townships in a way. And so this is in the 14th, and it's really working class. There's not much there. Louis Pasteur used to live in the 14th, right? But it's really kind of outside off the beaten tourist track, and she titles this Rue Daguerre in August, and this is Rue Daguerre, this pedestrian street lined with shops, right, that spill out onto the street. And what Mitchell is trying to capture with this is she's not illustrating it, right? She's capturing the feeling of it. Maybe some of the colors are inspired by things she would have seen there, but the bottom line is that she's not illustrating so much as she's evoking, right, the spirit of the place and reacting to it. And it's her reactions that she leaves on the canvas. And I've got a couple of details of this, right, because I just love sticking my nose into Joan Mitchell pictures because they just become these extraordinary areas where you see the range of thicknesses of paint, how much some areas are left raw and immediate, and other ones she's come back and really worked at it a bit, you know, pushing the paints into each other, developing areas where she allows the paint to kick out and splash and drip, right? Another detail here from the middle part of it, right, where we can see her different ways of working the paint, sometimes wet and wet, sometimes wet over dry, right? But all of it is meant to, through this action painting, right, to capture these gestures. And her stuff in the 50s is often on these very white canvases with these extraordinary colors that fill up most of it, right? There still is a sense around the edges that maybe this has an object-ground relationship that Pollock doesn't, right? That there is a space around the outside, a sort of negative space around them that then fills the areas in between them. But anyway, they're just really wonderful. So I just don't think we should look at just one painting by her. So here's a couple others, right, from roughly the same time frame, over also in the National Gallery. Sorry about this picture; it's quite old. When I didn't know how to take pictures of paintings as well. Piano Mécanique is a kind of a Dada title. The mechanized piano was in fact the name of a Dada orchestral piece, Piano Mécanique. And she's giving some homage to that. As we look at these things, you'll notice that I think this one makes it pretty clear. The areas down in the bottom parts end up being primarily horizontal. And then as we get to the top, they become increasingly horizontal at the top, right? And in fact, the more you look at her pictures, the more it becomes aware. And you were onto this in your paper, but I've sort of even begun to think about it when I was before I was even looking at it. Is that she's a landscape painter. She really is just a landscape painter. She's an expressionist landscape painter. But she's not trying to illustrate a particular landscape. It's not that. It's just this sort of emotional, gestural reaction to landscape. But at the same time, she finds within it these areas in the same way that the landscape would have a horizon line at the top, and then as you look down, things would sort of end up becoming more vertical. And that's exactly the case with this. And so all of these works, and I'm just looking at the ones from the 50s, right? She lived all the way into the 90s almost, is that right? Late 80s, 90s? And I just think that these are extraordinary pieces. They really have, and they're huge as well. She then begins to work even larger later on. But like I said, I think that for her, the thing is that she's very much a landscape painter. And I kind of begun to think of her as a modern impressionist in a way, right? And I think I made that in a comment on your paper, that I think she's a modern impressionist, right? Because she eventually moved in France to the city where Monet lived, right? And so the city of Vétheuil, right, which is on the outskirts of Paris. And so when we think about things like Monet's paintings from Vétheuil, from the 80s onward, there are these extraordinary explosions of color that sort of fill up the entire field. And you start to look back at Mitchell, it's an Abex version of these sorts of things. I don't think she's looking at particular Monets and say, oh, I'm going to make my version of that Monet. I don't think that's the issue. Although I think she's absorbed these things and is reacting to them. And I think this began for her at a really early age because she began her studies in Chicago. And the Chicago Art Institute is one of the great museums in the country. And it is an extraordinary museum for Impressionism. is one of the great Impressionist collections in the world, really. And they're home to some of the most famous Impressionist pictures of all time, right? Caillebott's Rainy Day is in Chicago, right? And again, I don't think she's capturing this, but, you know, Rue Daguerre, it's her reaction to a Parisian street, right? And the Grand Jatte by Seurat, it's Chicago, right? Ferris Bueller looks out on his day off, right? I think they go to the Caillebott as well, right? So these experiments with how you play with color and Impressionist mode are available to her at a very early age, and and it may affect sort of what she looks at when she moves to New York, also in Chicago, right? One of the water lilies pictures, and the more famous ones are in MoMA, the massive ones from the end of Monet's career. But there we get this sense of a sort of abstract landscape, right? That I think these are as much of an influence on her as anything, right? So Mitchell is picking up, she's still very much Abex. There's nothing not abstract expressionist about her, except maybe the whole Carl Jung psychoanalysis part. I don't know enough to say that way. But certainly I think she brings something new to the table, and in particular this extraordinary sort of channeling of Impressionist ideas and being truly a landscape painter, the external world, right? Whereas everything else seems to have been much more internalized. Now, the other trend in Abex, right? One trend is action painting. The other trend is what we call field painting or color field painting, where artists work on covering the entire canvas with this field of color or colors, right? That often go all the way to the edge of the canvas and don't really give us much in the way of gesture, right? And Barnett Newman is a really great example of field painting, right? At the same time, even though it's not action painting, one of the things that Barnett Newman and the field painters want to do is to discover something universal, discover something humanist. Dina, would you put your phone away? Thanks, those are the rules. Yeah. Discover something universal, something humanist. And for Barnett Newman, right, what he's doing is he's working with these strips of color against the field, right? And that's his sort of mode in most of his paintings, to have these against the single color of the background, one or two or three of these strips. And he actually called them zips, right? And he made them usually with masking tape, right? So it would paint the background color, then come over and mask out an area and paint in the zip, right? But then often would come over the top of that and repaint it after having pulled away the masking tape. So sometimes we have the very, very sharp edge of the masking tape, and sometimes we can see that sharp edge under the paint as he sort of worked it a bit more fully. And he wrote about what the zips were, right? What he thought the whole idea was. He says that even though they're painted on top of the surface of the background, he sees them not as something on top of it, but he sees them as an entryway, a portal. The zips were an opening through the field into something else, into a spiritual realm beyond the canvas. Right? In other words, as we look at the picture, the field becomes sort of a curtain that gets parted at various places that allow us then to go past it to something else. And this sort of spiritual realm that he thinks these provide entry into account for the titles he gives these pictures, right? There's a religious title, covenant, right? God's agreement with man for salvation. That's what the covenant is, right? The promise for our salvation. So the picture, the experience of the picture can be something that gets us to this really spiritual communing with God, right? And if we think about what Jung had said about how mythologies writ large, right? I don't mean this judgmentally at all. Mythologies, whether they appear in ancient Greek religion or Roman religion or Judeo-Christian traditions, right? that these can provide us some insight into our shared humanity. That's what Newman wants these things to do. These are extraordinarily humanist pictures, even though so many people see them as being kind of off-putting in that they're so hard to understand on a certain level. But the underlying motivation for them is an extraordinary level of connecting us with our shared humanity, right? Through abstraction. And so the titles, right, he gives these things all are mythological titles, religious titles, from either Judeo-Christian traditions or from ancient Roman traditions, right? Dionysius, the Greek god of wine. Now, it's not meant to represent Dionysus. Again, he's using these titles as evocations of the sort of spiritual realm that we're supposed to get into. And you can still see as you look at them, this is my photo versus that one I downloaded from the Hirshhorn. I'm not seeing that live because they never have it out. Hirshhorn drives me nuts. They have so many good pictures and they're never out. There's a reason. They have a mission. Their mission is contemporary art. They really have taken upon themselves to be the museum in New York. I know. I'm on your side here, but I also sort of appreciate what they're doing insofar as bringing art to DC that you cannot find anywhere else. But I know they're
also hiding art.
well. But most museums have roughly 20% of the works that they own out at any given time anyway. A museum's job is not only to show art but to preserve it. I know. I'm on your side here. I'm trying to give them a little. I'm trying to throw a little something their way, right? I really wish they had more stuff out, right, than they do, because you just again and again you go there and there's always like that same darn Thomas Hart Benton picture that's always out of the people of Chillimark, and there's always the same 5 pictures are always out, and I really just wish they would yank out their bar and their de Koonings are always out, right? But I do wish they would pull some of these things out, or just have a big retrospective of like, okay, let's just do this. The Phillips did that a few years back. They pulled out all of their modern American paintings at this big summer show of modern 20th century American art in the Phillips, and they just had everything, and they pulled out stuff that you didn't get to see. It was wonderful, right? That's where I got that Joan Mitchell picture, was from that show. I wish they would do that, just like, oh, here it is, right? Abstract expressionist artists at the Hirshhorn, and just have that for 3 months and put them out. It's a lot of money. It takes a lot of effort. Anyhow, back to the one here. What you can see now that this one is exposed a bit better, I think, say I humbly, that you can see that even the fields still have some of the rigor of paintwork, right? That it's not just a flat field of color, that indeed it's worked up quite thickly. And you can see also that now the remnants of the tape, and there's some mistakes that happen, right? It's not a clean edge, and part of me likes it better that way, because you end up, when you have experience, right, and if you're going to enter into the zip, which is what he wants you to concentrate on that, right? Immerse yourself in the picture and use it as a way to escape. Well, it's pretty damn dull if it's just a straight line that's perfect, you know? These little variations to the edge are what makes it interesting. And so when you find what happens there, where the paint is sort of bubbled a bit, you know, on the top edge of that makes it a little bit more interesting. And we'll find when we look at Rothko that these things can become extraordinarily immersive as an experience. They really do invite you to sort of suck you into them. And as they do, everything else around you sort of disappears. And this is really all you see, right? And there you can still see the remnants of the tape on the top and the bottom, but you can also notice that he's continuing to work at top down, bottom up. That I think the orange was there before the green was, right? I don't think he's come back with the green at the end. That strikes me as that would be a little bit too hard to pull out. And then there's these subtle variations within it as well, right? So I think that, you know, the simplicity of abstract expressionism is often a easy way to criticize something than when it's not really, or anything but, right? To get that sort of subtle variation. In 1958, he had a heart attack. And as soon as he recovered, or while he was recovering, he started to do 2 huge pictures of 6 by 5 feet, 6.5 by 5 feet. What?
We went to the National Gallery a few months ago. We saw this.
And they're right next to the Rothko room, right? So and so he works on these for like the next 8 years, right? This whole series. which he calls the Stations of the Cross, right? And so this is the very first one in the series, and again, using zips, right? And people asked him, what could abstract expressionism possibly... So, Stations of the Cross, do you guys know this? The Stations of the Cross for Catholics, right? Christians in general, are the places... So, during Christ's Passion, right, on Good Friday, the day that he's crucified, he's forced to take up the cross and go marching through Jerusalem, taunted all the way, to Calvary, which is outside the city walls, where he'll be crucified on the hill, right? And so he's walking, carrying the cross on the way to Calvary, okay? And this is a traditional set of images in Christian art, back to the Middle Ages. And it remained, to this day, remains a place where pilgrims go when they go to Jerusalem, is to go to the places along and follow Christ's footsteps on the way to Calvary through the city of Jerusalem, okay? And the Stations of the Cross are 14 places where something important happened while he's walking with the cross on his shoulders, on his way to Calvary. So he stumbles twice, those are two of the stations, right? He meets his mother, right? He meets the mothers with their weeping children from Jerusalem, etc., 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 right? There are just numerous places where things happen to him while he's already got the crown of thorns, right? He's already been whipped. He's now carrying the cross on the way to Calvary. So the Stations of the Cross are the stations where Christ, on the road, the Via Dolorosa, the road of sorrows, where Christ marched with the cross. And people asked Newman, what could abstract expressionism possibly have to do with that sort of narrative, that traditional narrative sequencing, right? And what Newman said is that they had nothing to do with that. That I'm not trying to tell the story. What I'm trying to do is to evoke the emotion of the moment, right? Rather than illustrate it. So when he finally finished the group, right? Because I think when he starts it, right, I don't think he's thinking about the 14 Stations of the Cross. I think that develops through the 8 years he's working on it. And then there's a big show at the Guggenheim with these 14 works, and he adds one at the end with color in it. And that's when he calls it the Stations of the Cross, but he gives it a subtitle, Lama Sabachthani, which is, it's Aramaic, and it's Christ's nearer to his last words on the cross, where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's Christ's lament, right? It's his heartfelt turmoil while hanging on the cross. It's not about physical pain, not about physical suffering, even though that's what the way to Calvary is, right? That's what the Stations of the Cross is Christ's physical suffering. What he's depicting is Christ's mental suffering, right? His emotional suffering, his sense that God has abandoned him, right? His Father has abandoned him. So Lama Sabachthani is, why have you forsaken me, in, I think, Aramaic, right? So that's what he's trying to achieve with this. I have one close-up, and we'll have a chance to look at this more closely here, where you can see he's just put a piece of masking tape down on this, I think it's an unprimed canvas, and then just sort of given us this wonderful sort of scouring over the top of it, right? It really is a terrific thing. And I think that room does a very good job. The National Gallery has done a very good job there, and with our last painter, Rothko, of showing us this sort of the spiritual dimension of abstract expressionism, the degree to which, and this I think kind of brings us full circle in a way, because one of the things that we've seen going back to some of our earliest classes is that there's a strong connection between abstraction and creating an art that is purely spiritual. That if you make an art that's representational, that reminds you of the physical world, it becomes extraordinarily important to focus the viewer on spiritual things. You've set yourself up with a problem. You're reminding the people of the here and now, but you want them to think of the there and the beyond, right? Abstract art doesn't remind us of where we are. It takes us immediately to somewhere else where different rules apply, right? Or maybe no rules apply, right? they've cut the bonds that hold us here in this mortal coil, right? And allow us to sort of, through the art, transcend to a different experience, to understand different things. So when we think about Kandinsky, right? He sees color as resonant with sound, and a way in which we can, once we get rid of the blue riders and get rid of the churches and maybe only see traces of them, we're now somewhere else, right? We think of Malevich, where Boy with a Knapsack becomes a black and red square. He's taking us somewhere else with this, right? Pete Mondrian, perfect example of that, right? And by the way, Mondrian, remember, spends his last years in New York just as abstract expressionists is getting going. So there's just all these connections with this, right? About an art that can transcend physical properties and physical limitations and take us somewhere sort of extraordinary. The other thing to mention with these, and we haven't done that yet, is to talk a little bit about World War II. Because abstract expressionism really gears up in the early 40s. Right? At the exact same time that we are deeply engaged with the most horrible war, hopefully ever, but goodness knows what's going to happen, in this century. And the fact that abstract art in America coincides with America's involvement in World War II, I don't think is entirely a coincidence. Because when the world around you is exploding, then why not turn to an art that has nothing to do with it? Turn to an art that creates a world where the world isn't exploding, where we aren't killing each other with gas chambers and trying to wipe an entire people off the planet. Why not turn to something else? And when we think about the first round of truly abstract art, back in the teens, Malevich and Mondrian are developing abstract art during World War I. Right? Kandinsky goes fully abstract right around World War I. And that retreat from the physical world seems like, to me, a very legitimate response to a world that's gone crazy, to a world where the rules are to more effectively kill each other. And then when we think about these American artists in the early 1940s, many of whom began as figurative painters, turning their backs on figurative art and beginning to adopt a non-representational style at a time when the world really sucks, right? It makes perfect sense. And I think there really is almost an A to B cause and effect there with war and abstraction. Our last artist, Rothko. I like him anyway, but he grew up in Oregon. We have one great artist who came out of Oregon. He actually didn't grow up there so much as he spent some of his youth there. His family was originally Russian, and they'd immigrated to Oregon, and spent time, actually went to grade school in one of the buildings where I went to college. It was where Rothko had actually gone to school before coming back to New York. A field painter. This is what he's best known for, are these large rectangular areas of color, usually layered against other colors in the background. So you do have a sense of objects against a field, but the field is just the most minuscule area around the edge on the norm. And he doesn't do this his entire career. He arrives at this style around 1949, but once he hits it, he doesn't go back. That's what he does, right? Plays with the variations of colors, plays with the number of actors. He actually talked about the shapes as being actors on a stage. He saw these as having a presence. And when we look back at his earlier works, which we'll do, we can see this, right? And certainly I think 1949 is the aftermath of the war. We're now discovering more and more of what the horrors really were, of the war. We're finding out about the genocide. And again, that increased push away from the physical world into something different. And these pictures are just extraordinary. There's more to them than meets the eye. And they really do merit spending a lot of time looking at these, because when you start to look at the edges, and he's working with thinned down pigments. He's working like Gorky was, where he put a lot of turpentine in. So what happens is the paint will stain the canvas rather than just sit on top of it. And I kind of like that idea of the paint doing more than just sitting on top of the canvas. Because when that happens, right, the painting becomes something different. Because it's not, it might sound wacky, right? But the painting is just an object that is colored. Does that make sense? So when you stain the canvas, right, rather than putting the top paint on top of it, where it seeps in and colors the entire canvas, then all of a sudden you're talking about the canvas as being something different than just a painting. Because now you're talking about it as it's an object in its own right. Does that make any sense? Kind of, right? Whereas even with Mitchell, right, you've got the paint on the outside of the canvas, but once you've stained it like that, then all of a sudden this painting is, yeah, we can talk about this and this, the purple and the black and the orange and the areas between them, and I will talk about that. But there's something about this that becomes a talisman. It becomes an amulet, an object that has its own sort of properties that aren't necessarily about representation. Right? He's transformed the canvas into an object of sorts, rather than just a representation.
I was just wondering if, in order to stain them, that means they're unprimed.
I think so. I think so. But again, I think even if it were primed, I think that if you put enough turpentine in, it's going to soak right on it. Right? The other thing that I've noticed, and I haven't seen the technical supports, but other than what they say on the website about these things, is that some of them are mixing oils with acrylics as well. Right? Which, if you've ever tried, is not advisable, right? It's very difficult to pull it off. But what I find myself looking at with Rothko's, and I think what he wants us to look at, these are very large, right? These are good 4.5, 5 feet across. Right? Is you end up getting into these edges where you start to see the brush strokes kind of pull away. And as you stare at them long enough, they take on a sort of landscape form. They begin to look like bushes against the sky, right? And as you look at them longer, and this will happen when we're downtown, right? You see, not only do you see that, but you start to see the colors begin to change as you're looking at them, right? That they don't stay still. And when we talk about this idea that somehow he's creating an object with a being, the fact that prolonged exposure to these works makes them appear to change adds to the sense that he's created something that has its own independent life, right? On the details as well. And just subtle things, the little bits of white that appear next to the black around on top of the paints as well. But also the places where it almost looks, as we look across the center, as if it's somehow there's our horizon line through the middle with the orange. Let's see what we got coming up next. What's my next picture here? Right. I guess I just had that one or something similar to it. But these eruptions, right? I mean, they're extraordinary pictures in the subtlety. And then I've always felt that these were like dreamscapes in a way, right? That you start to see down here, and then you begin to think of clouds or the aurora borealis or something like that. And he's not trying to illustrate. He's not a landscape painter like Mitchell, right? But what he's doing is he's creating these meditative, immersive experiences. And I think this idea that they somehow become sort of like dream landscapes, again, reminds us of the extraordinary connection between surrealism and abstract expressionism, right? That it exists on so many different levels, right? And just to point that home, here's an earlier Rothko, right? From before getting to this area. And you can start to see where we're getting. We've got these actors, if you will, the hierarchical birds against a background that is 3 horizontal rectangles of color, right? And at the same time, much more figurative. I was immediately struck when I saw that. I just took that picture this weekend downtown. So it's in the same room as the others, right? Or downstairs with the Pollock. But I was immediately struck by a connection to Max Ernst, who had also moved to New York, right? He ends up in New York City in 1942. Max Ernst does. Brings with him his surrealist ideas, and the conjugal diamonds could easily be the hierarchical birds of Rothko. And Ernst was not just out there, right? I mean, people would have known who he was because he's a very prominent artist by 1942. But over and above that, and I think I mentioned this before, he married Peggy Guggenheim. Right? Now, Peggy Guggenheim has this huge collection in Venice. The Guggenheim Venice is Peggy Guggenheim's collection. Max Ernst did. Married Peggy Guggenheim, right? So that puts him right at the center of the New York art scene, right? He's married to her for only 4 years, right? And this is before she takes up with Pollock later, right? But she's really at the heart of collectors who are sort of pushing modern art as a style and supporting it, right? So Max Ernst is right there. And I think that, again, the connection between surrealism and abex we can see as we trace artists' development prior to the sort of signature abstract expressionist style. Another early Rothko, right? And again, that same idea of the horizontal rectangles of color with these increasingly abstract forms playing against them, right? And if we keep in mind the fact that Rothko said that he saw all of his forms as actors on stage, right? That even as he develops from here toward his signature style of which are just the rectangles of color, he still sees those as having an entity, right? Having a life of their own. This one's up as well. Quite like I don't have anything more to say about this other than he increases in abstraction, and right around this year, 1949, he begins to get to this traditional form, and these early ones, more complicated, much more areas of color. But again, they're just absolutely extraordinary insofar as what happens as you look at them. That the blue line between the purple and the black will all of a sudden begin to just almost explode in front of your eyes. It becomes so rich. And then you become aware of things like how the yellow has been painted back up over that greenish orange. The fact that you can have a greenish orange is itself extraordinary. But then the yellow has sort of come back over the top of it, how he's worked this up so thoroughly, right? Everywhere we look. And that even though it's a field painting, it still has some of that action, right? Some of that bold gestural quality that remains there for us to see as he works this up. I'll just look at a few more of these close-ups. And on Friday, we'll have the opportunity to sort of do the close-up. Because there's a good 9 or 10 Rothkos out at any given time. And there's some out when I went this weekend that I'd never seen before. And that's the nice thing. The Rothko Foundation, right, donated over 300 Rothkos to the National Gallery. It's one of the biggest Rothko collections in the world. And it gives us this extraordinary opportunity to study these absolutely, to be redundant, extraordinary paintings. They really are just, in a way, extolling paint for what it is and color for what it is, and things you might not catch at first. Just those hints of that royal blue, that pick up between the red and the purple. It's just outstanding. And then the more you look at the purple, you begin to see things and drips he'll leave there that all of a sudden catch your eye for a few seconds. And these great sort of areas where it just begins to shift. And it's like I look at these things with wonder. And I think that's kind of the point, in a way that you would look at, like at the Aurora Borealis with some wonder. I've never seen one, but I would love to at one point. And you stare at it you look at it long enough, and you have this immersive spiritual experience that includes you, right? And that's exactly what Rothko wants. He got a number of commissions to decorate entire rooms, right? And not to decorate the walls, but to make large paintings to go in the rooms, right? And one of them was very commercial. There was the Seagram's building, and that was the basis of that play a few years back called Red, where he was going to decorate this corporate office building in New York, right? And some of the studies for that are in the National Gallery, but they're not out right now. But a couple of the more prominent ones, he saw them as being religious spaces, and he would call them chapels. There's one in Houston, for example, the Rothko Chapel in Houston, as part of the Dominial collection in Houston. And he would arrange these things in a way that what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to sit there and meditate, because that's what the pictures are supposed to inspire you to do, is to spend time meditating. And here in DC, we've got in the Phillips collection, right? The Rothko room there. Rothko actually helped them design the room. He came up with the measurements and the proportions and the placement of the windows. And that's why there's always sort of the same 4 pictures in this room, right? Is that because he designed the room, and they won't let more than 5 people in there at any given time, right? Because the point is that you're not supposed to be going ooh-ah and talking about it. While you're there, you're supposed to sit down and shut up, right, and listen to it. So in a way, having Bush Sr. die and having us talk about this here is great, because now we can go and sit in the Rothko room and just sort of be in awe of the presence of these actors that surround us all around there. Right? So for Friday, we'll meet at 3. If you have any trouble meeting us at 3, please let me know sort of by the end of the day tomorrow, okay? And if you need me to talk to anybody to get us there, but we're going to be in a bus, which is great. They're not giving us the taxi cabs, which is even nicer, right? I said, are you sure we can, isn't that more expensive? She said, no, it's actually about the same price. So we've got a little minivan, so we'll all go down there together and come back together, which is nice. And it'll be faster than taking the cabs, because they always get lost. And yeah, and we should be able to spend a good hour and a half down there, right, before they kick us out, which will be just about the right amount of time, right? Good. I will see you then on Friday. We've covered all the things on the slide list now, and so we'll just have a good time looking at pictures live at the museum. Yes.
Can I leave from the field trip to go home because my home is
Yes. Yes. You need to leave from there to get to. Yes. You do not have to ride back with us.